Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the webinar, Brazil and Goa Relations, a shared history and current linkages. My name is Rosana de Souza Silva, and I am the Executive Director of the International Cooperation Group of Brazilian Universities, GCUB. First of all, I would like to thank all of you for joining us. In particular, I'd like to welcome our two distinguished speakers, Dr. Aparajita Gangopadhyay from University of Goa and Dr. Bruno Feitler from Universidade Federal de São Paulo. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. It's an honor to have you with us. Today, we count on the special and the honorable participation of Ambassador Guilherme Patriota, Consul-General of Brazil in Mumbai, India, who will officially open this important event. Likewise, I would like to thank the important support and attention given to the organization of this webinar by Minister Erika Watanabe Patriota, Deputy Consul General and the Secretary Luiz Felipe Charnobai, Deputy Consul, both from the Consulate General of Brazil in Mumbai. I also express our thanks to Lusophony Society of Goa. Ambassador Guilherme Patriota, on behalf of the GCUB Board of Directors, I welcome you and thank you for your special support in building and strengthening the relationship between higher education institutions in Brazil and India. It's an honor to count on your presence. Ambassador Guilherme Patriota, you have the floor. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Rosana. It's a huge pleasure and an honor to be given the opportunity to open this important webinar. I'm very happy that you are contributing and leading us in this event because it's very important to keep Brazil-Goa relations very dynamic and to support strengthening of it. I'd like to also acknowledge my distinguished co-participants, Professor Aparajita and Professor Bruno. So it's also an honor to be with you. So you are the two sort of mainstay of our discussions today. Also, thank you, Rosana, for acknowledging the preparations by Minister Erika and Secretary Luiz Felipe. They are both part of we have a small but committed team here in Mumbai at the Consulate General. So we're very happy that they were in a position to help as well and support. I will read some opening remarks. I would like to be a little bit more general in my approach, so speak a bit about an overview of how Goa, Brazil is important for a Brazil-India relationship, let's say, and specifically also with respect to our common heritage and tradition between Brazil and Goa specifically. So again, this event is a partnership between the Consulate General of Brazil here in Mumbai and the International Cooperation Group of Brazilian Universities and the Lusophone Society of Goa. So again, thanking our partners. I also thank the speakers and I thank the audience for being with us here today. As you know, and this is something we always start from here, Brazil and India share many similarities. We are countries of continental dimensions. We are countries endowed with natural riches. Financial trade hubs as well, globally and in our respective regions. We're also complex nations with pre-existing societies, a colonial past, diverse peoples and cultures, a multi-layered melting pot society on both sides, I would say. Brazil was the first Latin American country to establish diplomatic ties with India back in 1948. So that's a year after independence, very soon, early on. In 2006, so big leap here, we became strategic partners, which is a concept that is very recurrent in diplomacy when you want to establish relations at the highest and most strategic level, and that's what happened in 2006. That was also the year we opened our Consulate General here in Mumbai, with a jurisdiction that extends to Goa and Karnataka. So this is Maharashtra, Goa, and Karnataka. We have 3 states. We cover those 3 from a consular point of view, and also a trade promotion, cultural promotion point of view. So we have maintained an official presence and a physical presence with our office here in the India's West region ever since we opened up in 2006. Brazil-India relations prosper and continue to intensify. The potential is huge, still largely untapped, in my view, and we must explore it to the fullest. Our leaders meet frequently, in spite of geographic distances, which are quite significant, and independently of the state of affairs, whether national or internationally. They keep on meeting, and we keep on having our very good relations. So this is a sign that there is political will and diplomatic investments on both sides to keep Brazil and India as our relations as strong as possible. Our leaders, they engage at G20 summits, at the BRICS and IBSA summits. IBSA is Brazil, India, and South Africa, a group of 3 countries from 3 continents. Also, and bilaterally, and in other several configurations, we're always dealing with India. Brazil and India are always dealing at the highest level in several fronts. We are like-minded nations on a series of international issues, whether they be discussed at the United Nations or in other bodies. Brazilian presidents have been chief guests at the Republic Day celebrations in Delhi. Shortly before the pandemic struck in 2020, President Bolsonaro himself was welcomed by Prime Minister Modi for a state visit. He was accompanied by a delegation of 8 Brazilian state ministers, 4 members of parliament, and over 120 business people. So it was a very important visit, I would say. He spent 4 days almost in Delhi, and there were several opportunities for making agreements between our 2 countries. I think there were 15 MOUs, different kinds of agreements covering different areas. So you can see there is a great desire to establish a relation with India, even at the formal level, at the highest level, and also at the business level. An amazing image that reflects how much Brazil and India can achieve together was actually captured last February on the front pages of many Indian newspapers. It was the successful launch of Brazil's Amazonia 1 satellite, mounted on India's PSLV C-51 rocket during a blastoff from Satish Dhawan Space Center. Therefore, we had an Indian-made rocket carrying a satellite made in Brazil, braving new horizons in outer space. That successful launch points towards a promising future of many more such endeavors. So I think it's a very nice image to keep in mind, things that we can achieve together. At its apex, bilateral trade, both ways, reached almost $12 billion in 2014. So that was the highest at the peak of trade relations. It's a fairly high number compared to trade between India and other major economic powers. For the past few years, however, commercial flows have remained around 7 billion mark per year, give and take, and as of late with a surplus in favor of India. Both countries are committed to reversing this trend. having settled a target to increase trade to 15 billion by the next year. So this was a target set between the two presidents, the two heads of state, when they met last January, 2020. Negotiations are underway to bring down tariffs for an extended list of products between Mercosur and India. So these are the different configurations that we can, use for our relationship. Mercosur originally was just 4 members. It was Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay. So others have joined. It's a free trade area in our region. And we want to open up this arrangement so that more products from India can enter at lower tariff rates. And then, of course, it's a reciprocal arrangement. The same would happen in relationship to Brazilian products entering the Indian market. On the topic that brings us together today, Brazil and India have much more in common than the shared intent only of closer and commercial ties, closer diplomatic and commercial ties. We have Goa, which has been a gateway for exchanges between India and Brazil since the days of the Portuguese. Centuries ago, gold and tobacco were transported from Brazil to Goa, establishing a route for the interchange of people, products, and all sorts of mutual influences between the two territories. To this day, a Brazilian visiting Goa will find many things resembling Brazil. Towns, streets, restaurants, Catholic churches named after Portuguese saints and characters. In Goa, and also in Mumbai for that matter, the tourists from Brazil will see the same Portuguese Baroque-inspired churches that have been built all over Brazil during colonial times. There will be a little bit of Brazil to be found in every Navisha, Dinesh, Dilip, which are common Indian names, who bear typically Goan surnames, such as Saldanha, Santosh, Sequeira, de Souza, Fernandes. In fact, for us Brazilians, these are Brazilian names. Konkani has countless words that stem from Portuguese, terms related to religion, festivities, family relationships, culinary traditions, among others, which will sound very familiar to Portuguese speakers. Flavors of the Goan cuisine immediately strike a chord with us due to their similarity with traditional dishes from the state of Bahia in Brazil. Such commonality is not a coincidence. Goa was the capital of the first Portuguese Empire, and Bahia in Brazil was the capital of the second Portuguese Empire. Both port cities were connected by direct sea routes for some 150 years, between 1675 and 1825. A century and a half, therefore, there was a significant flow of people, including state officials, soldiers, missionaries, between the two former Portuguese colonies. And these exchanges, they nurtured a shared history and consolidated strong linkages between Goa and Brazil, still visible, still relevant. Our common heritage has been extensively researched by the Goan professor, Filomena Siqueira Antony. Her work, published in 2013 by the Alexandre de Guzmão Foundation, which is a public think tank linked to the Brazilian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, is a most valuable source of information on the matter. Though our nations have bravely conquered independence and superseded the colonial experiment, it must be recognized that years of Portuguese presence in Brazil and Goa established a link between our peoples and culture, and even contributed to changes in our landscapes. The widespread presence of coconut trees, as they are embedded into Brazilian beaches, were brought from Goa and were, as well as were the mangoes and spices to be found all over Brazil. To this date, Goa still exports cashew nuts, which first came from Brazil. India is the world's fourth largest producer of natural rubber, a tree that is native to the Brazilian Amazonian forest and was transplanted to India and other South Asian countries. Goa is a famous tourist destination, but it also has strong presence in fishing and mining. Pharmaceuticals, biotechnology, and information technology are among the state's thriving knowledge-based industries, with investments from some Brazilian companies, I should add. When we decided to promote this webinar, our intent was to highlight our shared history, but not in a nostalgic manner. We would like to do so as a basis for strengthening ties for the future and for doing more together, including at the academic level, which I think it's a very important dimension of our relation. We want to show that our common past is a platform for joint endeavors in the future, and that the bonds that link Brazil and Goa over the years are a valuable asset for the greater goal of a Brazil-India partnership. And I thank you very much for your attention, for the honor of addressing you on this, on such an interesting and relevant matter as is the relationship between Brazil and Goa. Thank you very much.
Ambassador Guilherme Patriota, thank you very much once again for honoring us with your presence and for the important contributions you made to the open of this event. Thank you very much, Ambassador. It's an honor for us to have you, to count on your presence with us. Now, we will start with our honorary speakers. We will start with Professor Bruno Feitler. And welcome and thank you, Dr. Bruno Feitler. Dr. Bruno Feitler is PhD by the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales and Professor of Early Modern History at the Universidade Federal de São Paulo. He specialized in the history of the religions, institutions, and praxis in the Portuguese early modern world, with published works on the Portuguese Inquisition, the Church in Brazil, and the Portuguese Jews, among which the books in Português now, Nas Malhas da Consciência, Igreja e Inquisição no Brasil Colonial, and Imaginary Synagogue, Anti-Jewish Literature in the Portuguese Early Modern World, and a database of the lawsuits dispatched by the Inquisition of Goa from 1561 to 1626. Professor Bruno, thank you once again, and you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Hosanna. I would like to begin by greeting the presence of Ambassador Guilherme Patriota, and also greeting presence and my pleasure to be here today with Professor Aparajita Gangopadhyay. I would also like to say that I'm very honored to be, by the invitation to be here today, and to be given the opportunity to speak about themes close to my area of research, that, as you said, is the history of religious institutions in the Portuguese world, especially the Inquisition. But what we are going to do here today is an exercise in something that is more and more current today, called global history or connected history, because we'll try to understand what were the links between two regions that got in contact only due to the Portuguese maritime expansion. And Ambassador Patriota made a bit of a spoiler of what I'm going to bring to you, but it's it's good. So some will say that this is not effectively a global or a decentralized history, because as we'll see, what was almost always at stake were the interests of the metropolis of Portugal and the westernization and Christianization of what would become Brazil and of the spaces where the Portuguese were present in the Indian Ocean, the so-called Estado da Índia, of which Goa was made capital in 1530. Let me just share with you let me see how it works here. Just a second. I'm sorry to share my PowerPoint. Here we are. Let's see if it works. Okay. So, sorry. A second. So just a little map to have an idea of what we're talking about, of course. This is not a map of the Carreira de Índia itself, but it shows the main routes that existed between Portugal and Goa, and between Portugal and Brazil. And we can imagine that the links of which I'm going to speak about now. So, despite this bias of the Westernization, Christianization, it is possible to have an understanding of what was happening in the world from the point of view of the peripheries, without always starting from the center. And some of the cases we'll see here today will point to that. So that's what I try to build here. I should also note that the history of these connections, not being my area of studies, I prepare what I'll tell you today based in the fundamental works of José do Amaral Lapa, in a book called A Bahia, Carreira da Índia, the work of Anthony Russell Wood, that also has an article about these connections between Brazil and India, and of course the work that was already mentioned by Ambassador Patriota, by Filomena Sequeira Anthony, Relações Intracoloniais, Goa, Bahia. At the end, I'll show a bibliography, and I can share that with you later. In addition, of course, to more general studies on the Portuguese overseas expansion. We'll start by having a hint on the connections existing between both administrations. In a second part, we'll peruse the role of Catholicism in the circulation of people, information and models of behavior. And we will end by seeing what were the economic links existing between Brazil and the Estado da Índia, between the colonial, Brazilian colonial period, of course. First of all, we have to note that despite the obvious connection between Portuguese India and the arrival of the Portuguese in Brazil, after all, Pedro Álvares Cabral was on his way there when he landed on the coast of America in 1500. The Portuguese Atlantic world, meaning Brazil, Angola, Guinea, and Azores, etc., was always seen as separate from the Asian world. During the first centuries of the Portuguese presence in Brazil and Asia, there are very few records of direct contacts between governors and viceroys of Goa and their counterparts in Brazil. This lack indicates the administrative bifurcation existing in the government of the Portuguese overseas empire. 17th century authors report these geographical units as having separate economic structures, the Atlantic from one side and the Indian Ocean by the other side, despite, of course, the intermittent contacts existing between the two regions, especially on the route back to Europe. The stop in Brazil from Goa, especially in Salvador, was providential for repairs and for the replenishment of water and other provisions. Even so, Portugal served for most of the colonial period as intermediary connection, connecting them, and ended up creating a certain circulation of people between the two parts of the empire. The careers of crown officers were for the most part limited to the two worlds in parallel. But among high officials and also among members of the clergy, there was a circulation. There are several examples of governors or viceroys of Brazil who were later appointed to the post in India. even if the norm in a first moment was in the opposite direction. In fact, before 1518, the movement took place from India to Brazil. And in the later period, with the decadence of the Asian Empire and the increase of the importance of Brazilian sugar for the Portuguese economy, the direction reversed. In fact, even before there was a general government in Brazil in the 1540s, in the beginning of the colonization of the territory, at the time of the attribution of the hereditary captaincies to private grantees in the 1530s, many of those chosen had experience in India, whether military service, such as Duarte Coelho, that was the Capitão Donatário of Pernambuco, who had more than 20 years of diplomatic and military experience in Asia. Others, that's just one example of those with military experience. And others, as João de Barros, received their captaincies in Brazil in return for administrative service related to the Asian trade. They not necessarily did go to Asia, but they had this experience in the metropolis. The government's experience in the Orient or in relation to it was seen as useful by the crown in the new territory under occupation. When Brazil came under royal control in 1549, with the creation of a general government in the captaincy of Bahia, the use continued. Tomé de Souza, the first governor general, acquired this military experience in North Africa and in India. There was a complex set of issues that were taken into account when appointing a governor or a viceroy. But a clearly established fact is that every appointment was seen and understood as a career progression for these royal servants. And studying them allows us to understand which assignments and charges were most valued. However, when we reach the level of viceroys of India and Brazil, the prestige attached to the post in the East and the importance that it started to have in the Atlantic seem to have equalized them as the top of the career. There are examples of the late 17th century or of the 18th century and even the 19th century of men who served first in both Bahia and Goa before being appointed to the other colonial capital. Of course, all these men were Portuguese, born in Portugal. After mid-17th century, especially as soldiers, the colonial population of European or mixed origin also made the crossing. It is very difficult to find reports of voluntary passage from one side of the world to the other of native people, whether from Portuguese colonized America or from India. This was due to a lack of opportunities or even a lack of interest, if not due to a total social or religious impossibility. There were several attempts by the crown from the end of the 17th century to take natives from India together with their knowledge of planting and treating spices to Brazil. Despite the efforts and the advantages offered, apparently the number of candidates was close to zero. The chronic lack of human resources in Portuguese India from the end of the 16th century, in view of the growing preference of Portuguese migration to Brazil and the worsening of the conflict with the Dutch, ended up creating a flow, even if intermittent, of soldiers from Brazil to India. Companies of soldiers were sent by the Governor General in Bahia, and merchants from Brazil also offered to finance the deployment of soldiers in exchange for the concession of free trade with India, which was at the end not granted, at least not in the beginning. The image that people in India could build of these characters, these soldiers and other people that were sent from Brazil there, do not seem to be a very good one, as from the mid-18th century onwards, there was a flow of deportees, both from the kingdom and from Brazil to India. Filomena Cerqueira Antony's book studies in detail who these band people were, guilty of a wide range of crimes. But there were also cases of exiles in the other direction, with an unusual catechetical religious content. People judged by the Inquisition of Goa for heathenism, between commas, or for Islamic practice were deported to Portugal and even to Brazil. It is undoubtedly a question of sending those people to places where the possibilities of interaction with Muslims or Hindus would be much smaller than in the East, diminishing thus the chance of them falling back into the heresy or apostasy from which they had been condemned. So I'll bring here one example. This seems to be the logic behind the conviction in the auto da fé of Goa, dated 21st of April, 1697, of Deugu, a Brahmin, already imprisoned the first time for making pagodas or Hindu practices in Portuguese lands, which was forbidden at that time. His case was suspended after his decision to convert to Catholicism. But later, he was arrested a second time for the same offense. That resulted in a penalty of lashes and of 10 years banishment to Brazil. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to follow what happened to him after this. There was then, even in a limited way, circulation of people and thus of knowledge and images of the other. The role of the men of the church, both secular clergy or missionary, was essential in this regard. It is clear that the purpose of the circulation was above all, as I said previously, the imposition of Roman Catholicism and of a model of behavior based on metropolitan ways of living. We must remember that Portuguese expansion was primarily justified by the expansion of faith. It was not just rhetoric, as the Portuguese monarchs saw themselves as having the legal and moral duty to support and encourage the conversion of the local populations and to maintain the religious loyalty of the colonial population, in a process of strong political character that historiography has called social disciplining, disciplinamento social. In fact, it's a German theory. Catholicism, which was a central element of Portuguese identity, was an important link in the tenuous bonds existing between Brazil and India. Firstly, through the circulation of people, as in the case of the royal administration. It is enough to remember that the first bishop residing in Brazil, arriving in 1551, Dom Pedro Fernandes, had previously exercised important functions in the episcopal administration in the Diocese of Goa, where he dwelled between 1545 and 1549. However, very quickly the sense reversed, as the call for the conversion of Eastern populations was a much stronger motivation for the religious vocation of future missionaries than the conversion of indigenous people of America. Indeed, the challenge of converting Indians, Chinese, or Japanese was seen as greater and thus more meritorious than the mission among natives of Brazil. The reports that circulated in print and in handwritten brochures of the martyrdom suffered by Jesuits and Franciscans in the East are part of this image of the difficulty of the mission. Of course, demography also turned out to be an important factor in this regard, as while the Portuguese colonial population in Asia declined or stagnated from the second half of the 16th century onwards, it only increased in Brazil, thus making its population a possible source of candidates to travel to India. But let's get back to those stories that circulated and that can give us a hint of what was known in Brazil of the Orient. Let's start here with one example. In August 1551, so it's the beginning of the colonization in Brazil, the Jesuit Juan de Espicueta Navarro wrote to his colleagues in Portugal from Bahia, he was in Bahia, telling of how he rescued an indigenous boy that was about to be eaten by members of an enemy tribe. Navarro recounted of having baptized him with the name of Antonio Criminali, the Jesuit who, as he wrote, was killed in India in the service of the Lord. A native of Italy, Criminali was killed in 1549, the Fishery Coast, where he was a missionary, becoming one of the Jesuit proto-martyrs. So letters like this one of Navarro, which were also sent and published by the Jesuit of the East, as well as the passage of missionaries to and from India during their stay in Salvador, in Bahia, awakened the vocation of various local missionaries that had the Oriental mission as a mirror and model. There are several examples of Jesuits born in Brazil who not only participated in the missions in the East, but also contributed to the dissemination of information about India. One of the most mentioned is Father Francisco de Souza, born in the island of Itaparica in Bahia. He held important positions in the Society of Jesus in India, where he died in 1712. He's the author of a book written in Portuguese, which title is East Conquered to Jesus Christ by the Fathers of the Society of Jesus of the province of Goa. In this book, he gives details about local religions, the political relations between Indian rulers, and about native social practices. There are examples that these examples shows that at least among literate elites, there was circulation of people and information. As the anecdote around the name of Antonio Criminali indicates, there was also the circulation of models of sanctity and of devotions. In 1689, Jesuits and also the episcopal power tried to place the apostle of the Indies, Saint Francis Xavier, as a patron saint of the city of Salvador, mainly invoking his efficiency in protecting against epidemics, and also pointing out that he was a patron saint of many cities in Europe and Asia. The choice was confirmed by the crown, the Portuguese crown, and also by Rome, but devotion did not take off, possibly because the saint was not effective against the yellow fever epidemic that devastated Bahia that year in 1688-89. So it was a try, didn't work at that moment, but it worked in another way, as I'll tell you now. So still later, in the mid-18th century, in 1745, there was an interesting festivity for the enthronement of the image of the blessed Gonçalo Garcia in the Church of the Brotherhood of Senhora do Livramento, is Our Lady of Deliverance, in the city of Recife in Pernambuco. This was organized by the Brotherhood of the Homens Pardos, so men of mixed race. But their identity was connected not to the mixity of the race, but to their color. The Brotherhood was called the Irmandade dos Homens Pardos. Pardos is, a direct translation would be brown. Of course, it doesn't work in English, but that all the idea goes around this. So the occasion was immortalized by the publication of the account of the festivities and also of the sermon that was preached on the occasion by the Franciscan friar Antônio de Santa Maria Jaboatão. It's a bad image, but that's what I could get. Gonçalo Garcia, nowadays saint, was born in Baçaim, in the Estado da Índia, and was the son of a Portuguese man and an Indian woman. From Macau, where he went as a merchant, he left for the Philippines, where he joined the Order of St. Francis. In 1593, he went as an interpreter and missionary to Japan, where 4 years later, in February 1597, he suffered the martyrdom in Nagasaki. He is one of the well-known 26 martyrs of Japan. They were beatified in 1627 and canonized only in 1862. But while still in the 18th century, as I'm showing now, the East served as a reference for Brazil. In this case, more specifically to the mixed race population who, in need of social recognition, despite the economic ascent that many achieved, had to go to India to look for a saint fitted to their needs or of their color. The sermon preached by Jaboatão is in honor of the glory, and I quote, glorious and undefeated martyr Saint Gonçalo Garcia, luster, honor, and glory of all those who by their color are called pardos. But in fact, the central theme of the speech is the color, the brown color, because according to the author, the sanctity of Gonçalo Garcia was already well established. He says, in a direct translation, and I quote, "Here is a brown saint or a mixed race saint who all knew up until now that he was a saint, did not know him as being of mixed race or brown." So it's very interesting how during the Rose sermon, he explains, of course, he tells the martyrdom of Gonçalo Garcia, but instead of centering his speech on his characteristics as saint, he describes a bit of India and about the Indian population using the knowledge, literary knowledge, some of which I quoted a bit earlier. Priests of different orders circulated thus information and knowledge, almost always formatted in the mold of the Tridentine Catholicism subsidized by the Portuguese crown. But as the example cited shows, there was some space for reinterpretations and local appropriations. So I prefer to show here what were the human connections that linked these two parts of the Portuguese Empire. I thought it would be more interesting to try to understand who transited between India and Brazil and what kind of information circulated. However, it is clear that the material dimension of this exchange was also very important. And in this, a character barely mentioned until now was central. Of course, it's the merchant, despite the crown's monopoly on the main export products of both colonies. So according to the most traditional studies, Brazilian ports, especially Salvador, in their role as stopover points in the Carreira da Índia, were particularly attractive on the route back from India to Lisbon, as captains, sailors, and royal officers could exchange or sell there illegally Asian goods for sugar and tobacco, for example. Brazilian ports on these routes would thus be mainly ports for unloading and not so much for loading goods. But most recent studies shows that this was not always the case, especially from the end of the 17th century onwards. The main product exported to India, especially from Bahia, was tobacco. It arrived there either by recharging in Lisbon or by direct route from Salvador to Goa. In 1680, a board of administration of the royal tobacco monopoly was established in Goa, which shows the importance that the product had taken in the income of the Estado da Índia, as Professor Filomena has shown in her book. Contracts were awarded by local dealers from the 1620s to the 19th century. The ships that left Salvador for India also carried other goods as sugar, cachaça, skins, manioc flour, Brazil wood, and gold bars. In the other sense, royal provisions from 1672 and 1692 legalized and even encouraged the stop of ships in Salvador. And the local material culture, especially in sacred art, shows this. Oops, sorry. So this is an example. It's in the Museu de Arte Sacra da Bahia. Bom Pastor, of course, it's a typical ivory work in the Portuguese ivory work that is nowadays in Bahia. Of course, we don't know if it went there directly or through Portugal, but shows how. Or there are some others like this there. So the local material culture, as I was saying, especially in sacred art, shows how much Asian articles were appreciated in Brazil. But it was only a royal resolution in 1734 that authorized the sale in Bahia of goods of Asian origins, of course, with the due payment of customs duties. Textiles, pepper, porcelain, among others. In other words, in the 18th century, the Carreira da Índia took a new dimension. Direct trade between Bahia and Asia, also Mozambique and Macau. Since the previous century, there was a pressure from traders from both Bahia and Goa, in this case, largely Hindu traders. But the crown held out for as long as it could in fear of losing customs control of transactions. The royal tobacco monopoly ended in 1775, what encouraged individuals to trade directly between Bahia and India. Since the capital of Brazil moved to Rio in 1763, ships coming from Salvador had to stop there for inspection before continuing to Goa. Finally, it is not possible to deal with the relations between Brazil and India under Portuguese rule without mentioning the immense influence that this coexistence, even distant, brought to the ecological exchange and acclimatization of plant species. In Brazil, as it was already said, mango and jackfruit are considered by many to be native fruits. And ginger became an export product in the colonial period, when these and other plants were brought in several waves from India since the 16th century. Likewise, today, cashews and guava seem to be native plants in Goa. The acclimatization of cinnamon, pepper, cloves, and other Asian spices in Brazil, in order to try to, and I quote, to overtake the Asian spice empire, in the words of Filomena Sequeira Anthony, largely lost to Holland in the 17th century, was a much more difficult process that the metropolis failed to undertake successfully for both ecological and human reasons. In conclusion, we can see that the relations between Brazil and Goa during the first centuries of what is conventionally called the early modern period were more frequent than one might suspect, and that local populations, whether of Portuguese origin or those in contact with them and with colonial civilization, undoubtedly had a good idea of what was going on if they were not directly in touch with the other part of the Portuguese world. Thank you very much for your attention. So here's a bibliography, and I can share with you later.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bruno Feitler, for your excellent explanation. We will have maybe some questions in the end of the presentation, but thank you very much. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Leda Brasil. She's member of the advisory committee of GCUB and also international relations director at the University Federal do Amazonas. And welcome, Professor Leda. And she will introduce Dr. Aparajita, and she will moderate the seminar. Thank you very much. Dr. Leda, you have the floor.
Ok. Rosana, eu não tenho texto aqui para poder apresentar ao professor. Só recebi do professor Bruno.
Está no mesmo documento. Mas eu posso ler.
Ah, sim. Não, tudo bem.
I can read.
Ok. Já. Bom dia a todos. É prazer estar in English. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to stay with us. And now I do the presentation for Professor Aparajita Gangopadhyay. Professor Aparajita is currently in the Dean School of International and Area Studies at Goa University, Goa, India. She has been a visit faculty at Cheninchi National University, Taiwan, Department of International Relations, Marie Curie, University Dublin, Poland, Institute of International Relations at Vinicius University, Lithuania, and the Sciences Po Lyon, France. She is also a member of the Academic Council of the Indian Studies Program the State University of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. She is also the founding member of Center for International Development and Cooperation Research at the University of Bucharest, Romania, and an advisor council member on Center of Studies and Service on Contemporary India and Southern Asia, University Externado, the Colombia Bogotá Extraordinaire by the University Nacional de Rio Cuarto, Argentina. She has been an invited speaker to visit an institution such as the Argentine Institute of International Relations, University of Salvador, Lomos of the University, the Plata University, National University, Rosario, and the National University of the Rio Cuarto, Argentina. She has been a member of the Indian delegation to Brazil as part of government and India-Brazil dialogue in 2013. She has widely published in areas such as India-Latin America relation, India's foreign policy, India's diaspora policy, Argentina-Brazil relation and regional integration. She is currently working on 2 edited collections on bilingual issues, English and Spanish, on India-Latin America relation. After this, Dr. Rosana, great speaker.
Okay, I think Dr. Leda has a problem connection. You continue. I'd like to introduce and give the floor for Dr. Aparajita Gangopadhyay. Thank you very much. I would like you also to say that Dr. Aparajita is a special consultant of GCUB, and it's an honor for us to receive you and to have this opportunity to hear from you once more, Dr. Aparajita. You have the floor.
Thank you, Professor Rosana. Before I begin, let me also thank the Consulate of Brazil in Mumbai, Ambassador Patriota, Erica, and Luis. Ambassador would know that we are in very regular terms and conversations with them. So they're like, family for us. So thank you so much. And thank you, Professor Bruno. It was awesome because, I was really getting a lesson on Brazilian history and, I was all ears. However, as you know that I am not a student of, at least I'm not in the discipline of history. So although it was excellent, but somewhere actually I would not know so much in detail. So it was really good. When I spoke to Luis and he told me that you need to speak, and one question always sort of troubles me when I think about Goa and Brazil. Why are there so many peaks and there are so many points of low? There are these points of contact which are so much, and there's so much written about it, so much to read, so much to examine and study. And then there are the points where there is nothing that you can get in terms of sources between Goa and Brazil. So as a student of international relations, that somehow troubles me. And suddenly you have this long period of history, and then there is nothing. And then you have an issue of the liberation of Goa. And then you have very, very contemporary India-Brazil relations, which makes me more comfortable in terms of talking, which is more modern, and we talk about politics and economics and foreign policy. So that was the question that sort of came to my mind. What is that is there, and why we do not have this kind of contacts that ever exists, that came into existence as early as 1500. And the second thing that came into my mind when I was thinking about what I could speak on without, making a fool of myself in terms of history, was the question. A long time ago, I was taught by Ambassador José Leal Ferreira, who was for a long period of time in the 60s, the charge d'affaires for the Brazilian government. And you know, he used to be passionate about teaching Brazil. And then once he had come to Goa, and we were sort of walking past in Panjim, and he showed me this hotel, and he told me, you know, the Brazilians were living here for 9 months when the liberation of Goa was happening. And that got me very curious as to what happened. And unfortunately, there are no secondary source literature available on liberation of Goa, at least not in English. You know, I tried to read, I tried to understand, but most of the sources now you have are the declassified sources from the Government of India, Ministry of External Affairs. So these are the things that troubles you as a scholar, as a researcher. Why are there are these gaps between these relations? And because of that, I thought then, you know, let me just try to see what was the reason and if I can give any solutions. And finally, the last part so I've decided to divide it into 3. The first part is certain examples, you know, sort of select cases of this strong link between Goa and Brazil via the Portuguese. The second one, I'm at least trying to have some thoughts on the liberation of Goa and the role played by the Brazilians. And the third part is why today Goa does not feature in the narrative or dialogue between India and Brazil. We don't ever hear of Goa. Because at least as a scholar of Brazilian studies, I have not heard of Goa featuring in any kind of discussion about India and Brazil. So what are the possibilities where Goa can contribute to this larger narrative between India and Brazil? So I tried to divide it into 3, but I don't know whether it is very coherent, but let me just talk about it. Yeah, I'll just share my screen with you. So good evening, everybody, and I'll try to keep within the 30 minutes that have been assigned to me. Thank you so much for being here and for listening to all of us here today. So as Bruno was talking about, and you know, so if you look at, I thought I'd just put the most famous picture from Goa, which is the Basilica of Bom Jesus, which is everybody who comes to Goa sees this. And as you can see, as Bruno talked about, the architecture being very similar to what was in Brazil because of the Portuguese connect. So I thought I'd begin with that, so it makes us all very comfortable as to where we are located. And of course, the beautiful beaches of Goa, there is no question. I mean, the most fabulous beaches in India, of course, and in Goa. And so there is a commonality there. And as you know, as the Portuguese got here, they were doing trade through the, you know, they were the most important point of doing trade in the 16th and 17th century, the most powerful of the colonial traders on the Indian shores. And of course, you know, also that what happened in Brazil. So I thought I'll just talk about a little bit of some of these sort of, I wouldn't say as events, but there are certain things that I collected, and I thought that sort of linked the dialogue. So as we all know that, you know, Pedro Alvarez Cabral, he was attributed to the discovery of Brazil. And we know that he was actually moving and going to India, but somehow there was a big cyclone and storm, and somehow his ship landed up in Brazil. And that's when, you know, sort of, if you want to use the word, discovery of Brazil happened. So it was the Portuguese sea explorers and seafarers were the first who brought India, if you want to use the term India, or rather Goa and Brazil together. The interaction resulted from trade, which were as many of the good ideas as well as goods were being traded across from India to Brazil via Portugal, or as straight away as Bruno was talking about. So many common vegetables and fruits were the first things that comes to one's mind when we talk about, like rice, pepper, cinnamon, mangoes, sugarcane were carried to India, and you know, from India to Brazil, and cashews, pineapples, and as guavas. I didn't know about the guavas, but guavas also came from Brazil to India. Of course, sugarcane went from India to Brazil through the Arabs, Portugal, and finally from Europe to Brazil. Historically, of course, as I mentioned, that there is this big period of time, say between 1500, if you want to take, and 1822, which is the freedom of Brazil. There's a lot of literature available. There's a lot of literature. There's a lot of writings, books, sources, you know, which talk about this relationship. So historically, there have been lots of reference to this relationship. In 1590, and these are some of the examples that I picked up. Of course, there are many more. 1590, the ship of what Mr. Senior Antonio with Mateo de Albuquerque, who was the new governor of Goa, he was, he also landed in Brazil, and then he came to Goa the next year. So 1591, it took him almost a year to reach Goa. Agricultural experimentation, which I think in the first presentation when Ambassador was talking about, that the center of Quinta de Tanque in Bahia, which was run by Jesuits priests, and cinnamon from India was transplanted and cultured with considerable success. In fact, one of the Jesuit priests, Father Antonio Vera, he suggested to the King of Portugal that there should be a commercial cultivation of cinnamon. And the Portuguese king ordered for a quinta grafts and seeds, and native cultivators actually from the Malabar, and especially from, I think one could call it as part of Goa, was taken from Goa to Brazil to provide skilled care for this cinnamon spice, cinnamon spice. This was the first case of, if you want to use the term, technical assistance from India to Brazil, way back in 1690. So 2 agriculturalists from Malabar went to Bahia, and subsequently pepper and cinnamon crops flourished there. Of course, this was also moved to other parts of Brazil, especially to Para. And this is where these spices, as Bruno was talking about, the spices became one of the most important components of trade between India, Goa and Brazil through the Portuguese at this point of time. I put this picture up because, as a student of Brazilian studies, when we talk about colonization of Brazil, we talk about the Bandeirantes, those who came from Sao Paulo, and they would take the flags and, extend the territory of Brazil by putting a flag there. And even today in Goa, there is this festival called Bhandaram Flag Festival, and which is a part of Goan festivities. And once people say here that it can be traced to that particular event that happened. This to happen in Brazil with the Portuguese soldiers who would take the flags, and so somewhere actually the name itself also has a sort of a twisted to that Bandeirantes, Bandeira, the carriers of Bandeira, the Bhandaram festival, which is still a part of Goan culture and Goan society. There are other sources also which talk about Brazil and Goa, and the sources by Luis de Goes from Brazil, who traveled to India to join as part of the Society of Jesus in 1559. And as Bruno talked about a great deal about tobacco and how tobacco was introduced to Goa and to India. Tobacco was used as a preventive medicines against plague in the Portuguese territories. And then he talked about rubber and how rubber was brought by the British from Brazil to India. And I have read somewhere that they stole the seeds and they brought them to India and to Malaysia, different other parts of the British colonial empire. These were probably the first interactions between Goa and Brazil. The records dealing with society and cultures were also well kept and well preserved, because as we know that most of the colonial ships usually carried with them priests who kept a very, very meticulous record of all deaths, births, and other things. There are other records. My Portuguese is not very good, so I will try to read this. The Avisi Particolari delle Indie de Portugallo in Rome in 1522 and in 1555. The copia unas cartas de algunos padres y hermanos de la Compañía de Jesús que escribieron de India, Japón y Brasil a los padres y hermanos a la misma Compañía de Portugal, translation de Portuguese de Castellano Coimbra. All of this, actually all these documents have great mentions of Goa and Brazil and the links between the two areas. Another example of this was the writings of Father Francisco de Souza, a historian who was born in Bahia, who arrived in India in the middle of the 17th century and wrote a book on the Jesuit movement in India. I think Bruno just mentioned that, I think just a little while ago. And there are great references to medieval Indian history in general in that book. The Society of Jesus of Brazil traveled to India on a number of specific worldwide Christian church assignments. And those are also eyewitness accounts, which are very, very useful to establish the relationship between Goa and Brazil. Other instances of interaction included the Portuguese crown disallowing a scala or a stopover, royal letters in 1665, 1667, 1670, and on 18th of December 1670 mentioned the disallowance of a scala at Bahia for Indiamen or prohibition to sell the goods on ships, on board of ships destined to Goa, which were forced by circumstances to call on Brazil. So they were on the way to Goa, but for some reason they were not allowed to sell the goods on those ships. There are numerous instances of preferences of the Portuguese sailors mentioning the Carreira do Brazil over Carreira de India. So I'm just giving you certain examples which I thought established this relationship in a very strong manner. Many goods were taken from India to be sold, like panos de joris. I was trying to understand what is panos de joris. I know panos is, I think, material, is cloth. I assume that it's the kind of stitching that is done in India, probably that. In the social sector, many of the historical books on colonial Latin America make a reference to the unique and successful experiment known as the reducciones. It was introduced by Jesuits in South Brazil and in Para. There are community settlements organized by certain Jesuit missions in the 17th and 18th centuries. They mainly dealt with education, language, skills, culture, and medicine. But however, by 1767, the Jesuits are expelled, and this experiment also disappears. However, similar experiments were conducted in India a half century before South America. The Jesuits did similar experiments in Thana and in Basin, which is on the Malabar coast, where communal settlement was set up. Father Gonzalo Rodriguez wrote in 1557, it's called Trinidad, it's leaked from Thana, and we have already settled 30 souls. This flourished till 1739, till the Maratha invasions happened, and then it was completely finished. I was also reading about the great influence of the Portuguese art, which was visible, and they said that Indian craftsmen were taken to Brazil in the construction of churches, and especially Ambassador was also talking about a little while ago about the Baroque style, and came to echo Brazil some years later in the Baroque style, and this is from the book by the art historian Maria Helena Andres. She writes, all the lavishness of the Baroque art in Minas Gerais ceased to transmit exuberance, sensuality, motion, life in space, thoroughly filled with figures and symbols, attires of gods of Hindu pantheon. So she says there's a similarity between the kind of figures that you see in these churches with that of the Hindu gods in India. She further states that even pronounced is the Indian influence in the prophets of Congoanas de Campo, where the choreography of the figures, the almond eyes, the position and the movement of their bodies convey formal similarities to Indian temples and Hindu gods. So that's what I was trying to say, is that from a period of 16th century to 18 something, you see a lot of literature being written about Goa and Brazil, Goa, Portugal, Brazil. But suddenly you have this complete vacuum in terms of literature. There's not much written about Goa or its link with Brazil. And I was thinking why it was so. I felt that maybe one of the reasons it was because of the fact that Brazil becomes independent in 1822, probably this strong link that was there between India, Brazil, and Portugal was split or reduced, or not so significant anymore. So these are some of the pictures of the prophets of Congonhas de Campo, and I was trying to see if actually they look like Indian gods. Maybe the style of the clothing a little bit, but not really. I couldn't see the eyes and stuff like that. So anyway, the next sort of important watershed that happens in terms of Brazil and Goa is the liberation of Goa, which happened in 1961. Many people call it the police action in Goa. That is also another term used, but Goa's liberation sort of was a point of low, I would say, between India and Brazil relations, especially in that period of time, say from 1550s onwards. Ambassador said India-Brazil established diplomatic relations in 1948. And after that, between 1950s to say 1970s, this was a period of low, because India-Brazil relations had a lot of contention on a number of issues, whether it was the issue of Kashmir, whether it was the issue of Pakistan in 1965, whether it was the issue of liberation of Bangladesh from Pakistan 1971, and of course the most important, the liberation of Goa, where you actually see that there were significant differences in terms of approaches and opinions. So in that sense, Goa's liberation played a very significant role in India-Brazil relations. Brazil was very sympathetic towards Portugal, and it represented Portuguese interest in India between and it presented Portuguese interest in India when India-Portuguese diplomatic relations snapped on 1st of September 1955. It also represented a phase between India and Brazil, where there was seriously diplomatic tensions between India and Brazil on the issue of Goa. In fact, in 1961 or 62, there was an article written by Jânio Quadros, and which calls about the new Brazilian foreign policy. A lot of scholars, and also scholars who are presently writing, asked that Brazil was a democratic country till 1964. But what was the reason that Brazil supported self-determination of Portuguese territories in other parts of the world, but was against the same self-determination when it came to Goa? Why did Brazil support Salazar, who was a dictator from Portugal, on the Goa question? So this this was something that has been asked and raised by a number of people who are recently writing on this issue. This policy of Brazil supporting Portugal continued during the period of the military rule. In fact, Brazil's UN representative did support speeches of self-determination in the Security Council. However, its deviations on the question of liberation of Goa versus other Portuguese colonies raised questions. So when it came to the Security Council discussions, when Brazil was a non-permanent member of the Security Council, Brazil was talking about Portuguese colonies and self-determination, but when it came to Goa, somehow Brazil always stood by what Portugal was talking at that point of time. The question of the Treaty of Friendship and Consultation that was signed between Brazil and Portugal in 1953 played a central role in the question or the issue of the liberation of Goa and Brazil's relations with India. In fact, sources say that Portugal had approached the NATO for support on the issue of Goa, but which was declined. But despite that, Brazil stood by the treaty and said that they would support Portugal in all its issues regarding Goa. Serving as Portugal's representative, says Brazil was in support of the Portuguese claim. Although I did not find any significant straight statement which says the Brazilian government supports Portugal on the liberation of Goa, and we are completely against. So there are many mentions. There are so many, newspaper writings at that point of time from Brazil. There are, speeches made by the Itamaraty. There are speeches made by the president, the foreign ministers, which says that we are with Portugal on a number of issues, this, that, and all. But there's not directly. There was no statement that I could find which says, which went on record specifically to clear its official stand on the question of Goa. Most of the information about Brazil's role is available today, at least in India, through the declassified documents of the Ministry of External Affairs of Government of India, and also from the communiques of the Indian Embassy in Rio, when it was initially the capital, and later on from the consulate in Rio. They used to regularly send these reports back to India saying, this is what the Itamaraty is talking, this is what the Brazilians are talking about, liberation of Goa. Brazil's support to Portugal at the UN in 1961 on Goa, and at the same time, they criticized Portugal's colonial policies under some reservations in reference to Portuguese colonies in Africa, especially when it came to in 1962-63 on the issue of voting in the Security Council. So this kind of raises the question: what was that about Goa that Brazil supported Portugal, and why did Brazil not support Portugal in Africa? Okay, this is a question that comes, at least to my mind. What was the difference? Because if it's a colonial possession, you would have the same kind of reaction to any colonial possession and process of decolonization anywhere in the world. But what was about Goa that was different from that of Africa? They were also, Goa became, so therefore Goa became a hotspot of tensions between India and Brazil over a number of issues. One was about the closing of the Brazilian consulate in Mumbai, in Bombay at that point of time, especially the Honorary Consul General's issue of Jimmy Heredia issue. I mean, there's a lot written about him, and the fact that he was an Honorary Consul General, he was of Goan origin, and what I could find was that he talked about liberation of Goa at home, and there were stories that he was asked to resign, but then they were saying that he was actually expelled by the Foreign Ministry of Brazil because he talked about these issues at his home, which is against the setup of the Foreign Ministry. Then there was the issue which created again a stress between India and Goa, over Goa between India and Brazil, was the peaceful march of the nationalist Goans to Dadra and Nagar Haveli in 1954. There is also literature available which talks about why Brazil took such a stand, given the fact that it was a period of Cold War and the role played by the United States. So some literature talks about the fact that maybe United States compelled Brazil to take a stand, given that Brazil was a very close partner of the United States in the 1940s and 50s, having fought the war on the side of the Allies and benefited from the United States greatly. But again, not really anything concrete that we could get. Some scholars also write about the fact that the affinity of the African colonies of Portugal versus the Asian colonies. So when you look in the sense that Brazil had a more closer affinity and feeling with Portuguese colonies in Africa than had with the Asian colonies. So, Estado India, which is Goa, which was very far off for them, and it's really not something that they knew or they were interested in knowing, or the fact that, in Macau, the Portuguese. So it was like beyond Africa, they really didn't have much connect. And if you look at this period of 40s and 50s, really Brazil and India don't have much relations. Very little trade. Absolutely not really significant sort of relationship between the two countries. And as ambassador in the very beginning talked about 2006. So 48 to 2006. I mean, really, and especially after the embassy was set up, we really didn't have much to write about. Okay, so also, a sense of detachment and a sense of distance. So really, Goa, one could feel, one feels between the lines when one reads, is that it was just something that was there, and it really didn't matter to Brazil that much as the African colonies of Portugal mattered to them. So in addition to that, there was the issue of Vargas and Vargas' sudden stance on colonialism. Then there is this entire talk about Vicente Rao and the Pan-American Conference in Caracas, when he goes and talks about the Brazilian government's stand on liberation of Goa, President Café Filho's speech in Lisboa, Juscelino Kubitschek's speeches and statements made, and also all the statements made during the military rule, especially not the entire period of military rule, but 64 to 71, when they talk about Goa and other things. So when they talk about Indian liberation of Goa, criticism by the Brazilian government of that, Kashmir, creation of Bangladesh, the fact that the Brazilian government says that they could not imagine that India could take such a stance, and it's completely against the very spirit of what is believed in Brazil, and all these documents are available. Another important sort of issue between India and Brazil over Goa was the returning of a note which was given by the Portuguese to the Brazilians, and the Brazilian Charge d'Affaires in New Delhi had handed it over to the government of India in New Delhi, which was criticized, and it was returned by the Indian government, and especially because it was full of Portuguese government's accusations about the liberation of Goa. So this particular note was also a bone of contention between India and Brazil over the issue of Goa. I was just telling you that as I was walking with Professor Jose Leal Ferreira, who was my teacher, and we walked past this hotel, and this is the Hotel Mandavi, which is in Panjim, and this is where a large significant period of time when the Brazilians were located in Goa and working on behalf of the Portuguese in Goa. So this I just thought I'd just put a picture of it. It's next to the beautiful river Mandavi. This is a very, really, really historic hotel. Other issues, of course, was the issuance of the Portuguese passports by the Brazilian embassy to Goans of Indian origin. This created a lot of problem, and finally, the Brazilian embassy stopped issuing these passports, and this also had created, over the issue of Goa, created a big stress and difficulties between India and Brazil. And finally, the case of Senor Jose Leal Ferreira, who was about whom I was mentioning. He was the charge d'affaires during the liberation of Goa, and subsequently he was pensioned off in 1964. But he applied for a permanent status to live in India, and I think this was another issue that was between the Portuguese government and the Indian government, where the Indian government permitted him to stay in India, and he of course died in New Delhi at the age of 85. So he was our teacher. Later on, he was very much our teacher, and excellent teacher. So if you look at the narrative, as I was mentioning in the very beginning, there are these high points of narration and there are this no points of narration. Okay, so sort of Goa and the Goa question and the liberation of Goa completely disappeared from the narrative when Portugal accepted Goa, Daman and Diu as part of India. So then we don't see any literature written about Goa, Brazil, India in that context. The dialogue then shifted from India's relations with Brazil, and sort of Goa becomes a footnote in India-Brazil relations. You really don't read anything about Goa in terms of India-Brazil relations. Even when you talk about liberation of Goa, it is limited to students of history and international relations who critically evaluate this link between Goa, Brazil in the period of the Cold War. But as I mentioned to you, no secondary source literature is available on the liberation of Goa and the role played by Brazil. In fact, I had spoken to somebody here in the university, and they were not aware of the role played by Brazil, which is really, really surprising. Many explanations have been forwarded. It was maybe very poor links with Asia, very low bilateral trade between India and Portugal, Portuguese influence, the Brazilian interest, more strategic interest in Africa. All of these could be the reasons, or one of them could be the reason because of this low sort of visibility of Goa, or no visibility of Goa between any relationship between India and Brazil. Of course, and then we have from 2004 actually, when the first time you have the visit of Celso Amorim to India, and agreements and etc. All this very modern, economic agreements, strategic agreements, security, surveillance, all that starts, and you talk about modern India-Brazil relations. Ambassador also said in the very beginning that Brazil, Goa was considered to be a gateway to Brazil, but I think today, Brazil is considered by India as a gateway to Latin America. However, in this gateway, you do not find Goa anywhere. That is the question that sort of comes to my mind. I thought that maybe Goa could act as an interface, and these are just some random thoughts. Interface between Brazil and India. Okay, first, of course, most important, since we are in an educational seminar webinar, first should be the educational linkages that Goa could have with Brazil. As we are part of the webinar, which is organized by the GCUB. I think we are already taking the first step towards that. The Brazilian one, of course, way could be that Goa University and the colleges in Goa's university system could have study India programs. You could have programs where you could invite and attract students from Brazil who could come to India and learn more about Goa and Goa's role in this entire narrative. Brazil has already instituted 2 Brazilian studies chairs. One is at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi, and one is at the Goa University. We are soon going to receive a scholar from Brazil. She's on her way. We are just waiting to send her the letter for the visa purpose. So she would be coming probably next month to Goa. Also, I think another area which could be cultivated and which could be looked into with great details are the well-stocked archives and libraries, both in Brazil and in Goa. Goa has excellent archives here, and of course there is also the Xavier Institute's archives, which are of course also available. So all these sources could be great sources of information about the historic links between India and Brazil through Goa, and this could be harnessed to integrate educational institutions in both the countries. Okay, with Goa being the nodal point. Languages, of course, Portuguese language is a common factor, which is between Goa and Brazil. I think that there a lot of work could be done, especially in terms of literature, language, the kind of literature that is available from Goa in Portuguese, and that could be, or Konkani language and literature, which could be translated to Portuguese, and vice versa. Cultural connections, great influence of Portugal, and that from that sense, Portuguese language and music in Goa, especially the singing called Mando in Goa, which is very, very important, and which carries the tradition and the dances. Then, of course, sports. Goa is a football crazy place, just as Brazil is a football crazy place, and their sports could be another area of these significant linkages between Goa and Brazil. In fact, I'll just show you a picture. This is a local football club in Goa called FC Goa, and there are presently 13 players from Brazil who are playing for FC Goa from 2015 onwards. So they have come and gone, and so see, already linkages are there established, and this, better infrastructure, better connections could be established between different football clubs in Brazil and with the football clubs in Goa. I think that is another very, very important and something very exciting to do. Then, of course, diaspora linkages. Now, Indian government uses the diaspora connections in different parts of the world, especially the more developed parts of the world. The diaspora are considered to be a strategic asset. This is our language of international relations, a strategic asset. Strategic relations, ambassador spoke about that in the very beginning. Strategic relations, strategic asset. However, in Latin America in general and in Brazil in specific, this Goan Indian diaspora has never been used by the Indian government to improve India's relations with Brazil, and which is itself something really, really sad. Okay, so although the number of Indian people of Indian origin are not that many in Brazil, but I think there could be people who have Goan, Brazilian, Portuguese origins who could be these kind of people who could be used by the government of India in terms of improving its own visibility, in terms of improving its own relations with Brazil. And another, of course, is tourism, which is another sector where there could be more connections. In terms of Brazil has this awesome tourism sector. The beaches and everything is so beautiful, so well kept, and the Brazil could help Goa and government and India to develop its infrastructure, to establish the historical linkages that they could work on that between Brazil and India and Goa, popularize Goa as a holiday destination for people in Brazil, because as the previous ambassador Rosemar had once told me that Goa looks like Brazil, and which is true. When I went to Rio, I found it looks like, I could almost imagine that I am in Goa. So it looks like, so I think that could be something that could be expanded, that could be thought about, and something could be done on terms of both. But it has to be done both at the national level of governments and at the state level of governments, which is the Goan government has to be incorporated in such a plan. And of course, Carnival is something which is part of Goa, and hundreds and thousands of people come in the month of February to see the Carnival in Goa. And of course, there is the Carnival in Rio, of course, which is something that there is a common link there, and that could be used to expand this link that Goa could have with Brazil, irrespective of India's links with Brazil. This is the music and the dance pictures. So I think I'm going to finish with the last slide, which is decline of Goa and India-Brazil relations. As I said in the very beginning, there are these points of high, and then there are points of nothing. Okay, why? So India-Brazil relations have to look beyond trade, beyond strategic relations, beyond economy, beyond foreign policy, and people-to-people contacts are very, very important. And given the fact that in Goa, Brazil have a historical linkages, I think somewhere that needs to be cultivated, that needs to be used. And location of Goa, I think, can work very well in that kind of a scenario. India-Brazil relations have grown, as Ambassador said, you know, in 2014, it was $14 billion of trade and generally $7 billion overall. You know, we talk about India-Brazil relations and we talk about the highs of India-Brazil relations. We talk about IMSA, we talk about BRICS, we talk about so many other things, the visit of the president of Brazil in 2019 to India. So India features in this large, this equation of India-Brazil relations are on the rise, on the growth. How can we add Goa to this equation? This is what should be the question that we should be asking ourselves today. It should not be merely limited to cultural connections. Cultural connections is fine, language, literature, music, all that is fine, but it should be something more significant than merely cultural connections. Neither India has projected Goa as a possible educational, cultural, economic hub, nor has Brazil looked at Goa in that sense, modern Goa. I think this is somewhere we could understand and examine if this could be something that could be looked at in the future in terms of India-Brazil relations. Thank you. Thank you so much.
So I think Professor Leda, I don't know if she has a problem yet. So I continue. Thank you very much, Dr. Aparajita. It was a pleasure for us. Thank you for the important information. It's very nice to understand better the relationship between India and Brazil, and especially between Goa and Brazil. Thank you very much. And I'd like now to introduce Mr. Aurobindo Xavier. He is the president of Lusophone Society of Goa. And thank you very much to participate here with us, Dr. Aurobindo. And you give the floor and you can greet the participants for some minutes. And after that, the Ambassador Guilherme Patriota will make the final remarks and formally close the seminar. And if you have some question or some comments, of course, you can make it. And please, Mr. Aurobindo Xavier. Sorry, we cannot hear from you.
So thank you very much, Professor Rosana, for your kind introduction. I would say good morning or good afternoon, or depending in which country. I am just in Lisbon, so it is difficult to say good morning or good afternoon. For us, it's good afternoon now. Well, in Goa also is good afternoon, and in Brazil, I suppose it's also good afternoon, so PM time. So I would say a special good afternoon for Ambassador Guilherme Patriota, supporting this seminar, concentrating your efforts from the consulate to promote Goa. And this I find very relevant, because there must be the highest concentration of Portuguese-speaking people in India is in Goa. So this is a good cultural infrastructure to promote these relations between Goa and Brazil. Well, Professor Bruno, good afternoon also for participating. Not last but not least, Professor Aparajita. I'm sorry if I don't spell well your name, but good afternoon for you, also for your presence. Very important of the University of Goa. And we support from beginning on in our society all the efforts done by the consulate, by the Embassy of Brazil in Delhi, even by the Embassy of India in Brazil. We are talking, speaking to all these people, and this is very, very important, as Ambassador Patriota told, to promote the relations, cultural, economical, military even, is very important, because it must be done with the embassy and the consulate representatives of Brazil in India. They have to support us, because this is the very important institutional people that know the both sides very good. And you know, during 450 years, during the colonial time in Goa, we had a lot of very good connections with Brazil, not directly maybe to Brazil. It was difficult at that time. You can imagine a caravel crossing from Goa to Portugal through Salvador. It took 6 months sometimes. Sometimes they never arrived in Lisbon or back from Lisbon to Goa because of the specific meteorological situation or military situation also, because the English people was pushing down Portugal concerning the commercial relationships. It was very important at that time, because Portugal was controlling more or less this trade between Europe and India. Right? India, there was no India. There were several states, but not similar as we have now, the states, independent states that had a connection with Portugal also, in Gujarat, and room and space, and in other spaces also, because the discovery of India for the Portuguese, it was not a discovery. India existed for 4,000 years back. So, but for the Western culture, discovery for Portugal and for Europe was limited only for the coastal sites. Not even, they didn't went far away to the interior of India. So that the concept of India for Europeans from beginning on, for Central European, for Germans, for French, there was India of Marco Polo and from Greek people. So a very strange concept, more limited to culture and a little bit to trade. So not that was Portuguese, or Portugal did after 16th century, concentrating on the trade and monopolizing the trade. Well, only few remarks regarding this. You are right, Professor Aparajita, that there's a lot, millions of pages written in Portuguese about Goa and relation Goa-Brazil. Also, millions and millions in Portugal, specific in Goa in archaeological, especially in archaeological department. But these millions and millions are related not only Portugal to Brazil, but Portugal to Goa also, because for the Portuguese people, there was they were describing the imperial idea of Portugal, not related only to Brazil. Brazil was very important, and South Portugal, Algarve was very important. So they were relating Goa within these documents, within all the historical documents that are in Torre do Tombo in Portugal, millions and millions, and Arquivo Ultramarino in Portugal is incredible. What do you have there regarding the relationship between Goa and Brazil or Portugal? Not directly Goa, Brazil, but indirectly, notes for regarding this. Well, I suppose that's very important. Your contact with Professor Bruno and through the Professor Rosana, I think, and the support of the Ambassador Patriota is very important for promoting the relation, not only historical and cultural, also the present and the future relations between Brazil and India through Goa. We are defending all the time that platform should be a preferential link between India and Brazil. Surely Goa is not able to develop important trade relation to Brazil. It's impossible. But this is very, a lot of Brazilians, when they come to India, and a lot of Europeans still now, from the companies, Brazilian, Portuguese companies or German companies I know very well, they tell their people, please stay some weeks in Goa before entering in India, for the accommodation culturally and climate. And so I think this platform Goa, as Ambassador Patriota told us in the beginning, should be promoted, and we are supporting your efforts to the link with Professor Bruno and to Brazil. It will be very positive. Thank you very much. I'm sorry that I spoke so around 10 minutes, but thank you very much for everybody participating in this seminar.
It's our pleasure, Mr. Aurobindo Xavier. Thank you very much. It's very, very important for us to count on your presence here. And I take this opportunity to say that it was a pleasure for us to organize this important seminar on the support of our General Consulate in Mumbai, University of Goa, and also the Lusophone Society of Goa. Thank you very much. I'm sure that we have a lot of possibilities to develop it, and I hope we can do it, especially in the higher education sector, in the research. In next year, I hope we can organize some events face-to-face here in Brazil, also in Goa. We can organize missions composed by researchers, rectors from our institutions. So you can count on us to it, and thank you very much. So now I would like to invite the Ambassador Guilherme Patriota to make the final comments, and also to formally close the seminar. Ambassador Guilherme Patriota, thank you very much for everyone.
Yes, thank you so much, Rosana. I had a hard time here unmuting myself. I know that we're sort of running out of time. There's so much to be said. In light of the great presentations that we just heard, I think it was a real pleasure, and I think a great initiative to have this conversation. We should have it more. I really enjoyed both of them because one was looking further back with the perspective of a historian, Professor Bruno Feitler from the Federal University of São Paulo. I enjoyed immensely your presentation, your insights, and the information that you provided to us. And then followed by Professor Aparajita Gangopadhyay from the University of Goa, also a scholar who brought us the perspective, perhaps a bit more recent perspective of Brazil-Goa relations based on her expertise in foreign policy, which is quite commendable. What I think was a common trait in both is the fact that our relations are incredibly linked with each other, but they suffer from ups and downs and gaps. Historical gaps in the past, today, gaps maybe that derive from different movements on each side politically and in terms of external alliances as well, because we fall in different spheres of alignments and influence. So it's very interesting when Professor Bruno mentioned the early history of colonization, the colonial process. It's interesting how, the connections, even though we belong to the same Portuguese empire, but the connections were really based on the self-interest of the metropolis, and what kept us together in the same route were trade, very concrete interests in terms of trade, but not modern trade. It was colonial trade. There was a movement that was in terms of expanding a view, the faith of the Roman Catholic Church globally. So there was a globalization of faith at that time. And missionaries, therefore, were at the vanguard of this process. And also militarily, that would also be accompanied by military officers going back and forth. It wasn't really a people's movement that occurred during those days. There were, in fact, certain controls that were imposed, as was mentioned, I think, by Professor Aparajita, for example, ships touching the Brazilian colonial coast at the time, going towards Goa, could not provide any goods in Brazil, no contact. So there was a deliberate attempt at maintaining the different colonies that belonged to the same system, but keeping them in a way separate from each other. And we suffered from that throughout our common history. More recently, Brazil and India, we've moved back and forth. There was the two great wars, and then there was the independence of Brazil was earlier on, but many issues. Of course, independence is one act, but real independence takes time. We are in a different sphere of influence diplomatically, and we've shifted our allegiances a little bit back and forth. When Goa, the issue of Goa appeared in '61, it was at the precise moment when Brazil was a bit shifting from a more Anglosphere or US aligned automatic alliances towards a more independent foreign policy. We do have a heritage coming from Africa that is very present in Brazil, because a third of our population is made up of the people that were brought forcibly from Africa into Brazil. We do not have an Indian or an Asian diaspora to speak of that could have affected earlier our position with respect to Goan independence movements, for example. Whereas in Africa, this shift was occurring politically in Brazil. So it was a moment where we were all of a sudden more progressive in our outlook towards self-determination with respect to Africa, and a feeling of solidarity and a foreign policy that actually was even more progressive towards them than it was towards ourselves and towards our own region. So yes, that's a historical fact. But in respect of Goa, also, I must comment that Goa's independence movement did not lead to the independence of Goa as such, but Goa became a part of India. So I think there was a slightly different perspective here too, a shift from one well-known and one of the first great colonial empires that was Portugal, and then Spain, and then a shift towards another type of empire that came later, perhaps more modern in nature, which was the British Empire. Lasted much longer and perhaps even more effective in the way they organize themselves globally. But all these movements, they do fail, and they will not lead to concrete action if we don't work towards that. So I like to mention Goa all the time. I think the common heritage is a platform we should work with. But of course, there are there are some obstacles on each side. We do not have easy direct connections. People to people, it's expensive. There aren't that many encouragements occurring naturally for people to flow back and forth. The government on each side, I think, also need to keep this flame alive. Sometimes either Brazil or even in the Indian side, relations with Brazil is really captured by the center in India. So it's really articulated from Delhi, from the central government. So there is a kind of a very centralized perspective there. Today, there are interests that are very commercial in nature, direct financial flows. People are looking towards big partnerships, big company partnerships and things like that. And the smaller dimensions, such as Goa, which is in some respects, perhaps I see it a little bit of a niche aspect of India, they get lost in translation. But right now, I think the tourist aspect is very attractive, very important. A lot of Brazilians go to Goa because of the Portuguese heritage. They don't necessarily go seeking business, but they go seeking to get a knowledge of India in a place that they may feel more comfortable with, or perhaps they will be more easily assimilated and will understand India better. So it's an easy spot to land on for Brazilians here, and you will see many are there. When we had repatriation flights due to COVID, we had to help many Brazilians scattered around the Goan region. So it is a very popular spot for Brazil. But we have to work towards other things. I think the academic side, the language is very important. So I really commend also Professor Aurobindo Xavier for his the Lusophone Society of Goa. I think it's incredibly important. We should also try to establish additional ties and see if we can exchange professors of Portuguese or even history and other things, so that we can intensify a little bit our the opportunities that are there. So that's my final words. I enjoyed this. I think we should do more of it. And I'm really happy that Professor Hosanna helped us carry this forward, and that all of you took the time to participate and to honor relations between Brazil and Goa in such a manner. Thank you very much. And I hope we see each other again. Thank you.
Thank you very much for all of you. Thank you.